Just before dawn on January 31st, 1944, the shoreline south of Rome was silent in a way that made soldiers uneasy. The sea at Anzio looked calm, almost harmless, but everyone on that narrow beachhead knew the calm was fake. Somewhere beyond the low hills and vineyards, German engines were warming. Steel was moving. Tracks were turning. An armoured counterattack was coming, and the men waiting for it were tired, exposed, and badly outnumbered. Among them was a single American radio operator, sitting in a shallow foxhole with a handset pressed tight to his ear, unaware that in the next few hours his voice alone would help stop an entire armoured push from breaking through the Allied line. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. The Anzio landing had begun 10 days earlier on January 22, 1944. It was meant to be a bold strike, a fast move behind German defences in Italy. The plan was simple on paper: land quickly, push inland, cut supply lines, and force the Germans to retreat. But reality moved slower. The beachhead stayed narrow. The push inland stalled. By the end of January, the Allied force was boxed in, with the sea behind them and German divisions gathering in front. German commanders saw their chance. If they hit hard enough, fast enough, they could push the Allies back into the water. By the night of January 30th, German armoured units were already forming up. The attack would come from multiple directions, using tanks, self-propelled guns, and infantry working together. One of the main thrusts was aimed straight at the American lines held by exhausted infantry units who had little armour support of their own. The ground was flat, broken by ditches, low walls, and patches of farmland. It was perfect tank country, the kind of place where armoured divisions could roll forward and crush everything in their path. The American soldiers on the line could hear it before they saw it. A low, distant rumble. The sound of engines running under cover of darkness. Officers checked maps. Platoon leaders moved quietly between positions. Machine gunners adjusted their fields of fire, and radio operators checked their equipment again and again, knowing that if the attack came, radios would matter more than rifles. One of those radio operators was Private First Class Forrest L. Vossler. He was not a famous officer. He did not command men. His job was simple and deadly important. He carried a heavy SCR 300 radio set, kept the antenna upright, and maintained contact between frontline units and artillery batteries positioned farther back. Vossler had already been under fire for days. He had slept in short bursts, eaten cold rations, and worked his radio through shelling that never fully stopped. Still, when the attack came, he stayed on the line. At around 4 a.m., the German artillery opened up. Shells slammed into American positions, tearing through sandbags and tossing dirt into the air. The bombardment was meant to pin the defenders down while tanks and infantry moved forward. Vossler's radio crackled with urgent calls. Units were reporting movement. Flares went up. In the half-light before sunrise, German armour began to appear, dark shapes moving steadily closer. The first tanks rolled forward with confidence. German crews believed the American line would break. They had numbers, firepower, and momentum. But what they did not see was the thin chain of communication linking the front line to the artillery behind it. That chain ran straight through Vossler's radio. As shells burst around him, Vossler stayed on the air. His position took direct hits. Shrapnel tore through his equipment. At one point, an exploding shell smashed the radio set, damaging the antenna and knocking him to the ground. His hands were bleeding. His face was burned by flying debris. But instead of pulling back, Vossler dragged the radio into a new position and began repairing it under fire. When the radio came back to life, he immediately began passing coordinates, tank movements, infantry, concentrations, estimated distances. Every message he sent helped artillery officers adjust their fire. Guns several miles away began to speak, sending heavy shells screaming down onto the advancing German armour. Explosions walked across the fields, tearing tracks off tanks, flipping vehicles onto their sides, and forcing infantry to scatter for cover. The German attack slowed, but it did not stop. More tanks pushed forward, trying to find gaps in the barrage. Smoke and dust filled the air. American infantry clung to their positions, firing when they could, retreating only a few yards at a time. Vossler stayed connected, relaying new coordinates as the enemy shifted. His voice grew hoarse, but his transmission stayed clear. At one point, Vossler was wounded again. A shell exploded nearby, throwing him backward and tearing open his leg. Blood soaked into the mud beneath him. Another blast damaged the radio headset, making it nearly impossible to hear. Vossler did not leave. He held the damaged handset to his ear and continued transmitting, repeating messages until he was sure they were understood. As daylight came, the battlefield revealed the damage. Burning tanks littered the fields. German infantry hugged the ground, unable to advance through the wall of artillery fire. What had been planned as a fast armoured breakthrough had turned into a stalled, costly fight. German commanders tried to push fresh units forward, but each movement was spotted and reported. Each adjustment was answered with more fire. The attack that was supposed to crush the beachhead began to collapse under its own weight. Tanks that broke through initial fire were isolated and knocked out. Infantry units took heavy losses trying to keep up. By late morning, the German armoured thrust had lost momentum. The line held. Vossler finally collapsed after hours of non-stop work. When medics reached him, they found a man barely conscious, still gripping his radio. He had been wounded multiple times, burned and partially deafened by the explosions around him. But his radio had never gone silent when it mattered most. The German counterattack at Anzio did not end the war, but it failed to do what it was meant to do. It did not drive the Allies into the sea. It did not break the beachhead. And at the centre of that failure was the simple fact that American artillery never lost contact with the front line. One radio operator, refusing to leave his post, helped turn a dangerous armoured assault into a stalled, bloody setback. Later, commanders would review reports and maps, studying how the attack had been stopped. They would talk about artillery coordination, defensive depth, and unit discipline. But on the ground, the truth was simpler. A single soldier stayed on the radio under fire, and because of that, the guns kept firing at the right place, at the right time. This was not a story about luck. It was about endurance, about staying in position when every instinct tells you to run. Vossler did not stop an armoured division with a weapon. He stopped it with information, with timing, with a voice that refused to go quiet. When the guns finally fell silent on the Anzio front later that day, the battlefield looked nothing like the confident German plan drawn up just days earlier. Fields that were supposed to be rolling highways for armour were now torn apart by shell craters. Disabled tanks burned quietly, their crews either dead, wounded, or pulled back in confusion. What was meant to be a clean armoured breakthrough had turned into a grinding failure, and German commanders knew something had gone wrong at a very basic level. German after-action reports from the Anzio fighting repeatedly mentioned one frustrating problem. Every time armour tried to shift position, artillery fire followed almost immediately. Every attempt to regroup drew new barrages. It felt, to the men on the ground, as if the Americans could see everything, but the Americans did not have perfect visibility. What they had was communication that refused to break, even under extreme pressure. At the centre of that communication was Forrest L. Vossler, a man who never intended to be part of any heroic story. Vossler was trained to relay messages, not to fight tanks. Yet on January 31st, 1944, his role became more important than any rifle or machine gun on the line. His radio linked the fragile infantry positions at Anzio with the heavy artillery that could actually stop armoured formations. As German forces pulled back and reorganised, American officers began to realise just how close they had come to disaster. The beachhead had been thin. Reserves were limited. A full armoured breakthrough could have split the Allied force in half. If communication had failed for even a short time, artillery would have gone blind, and German tanks would have reached the supply dumps and command posts behind the lines. Vossler was evacuated only after the fighting eased. Medics carried him off the field with severe wounds, burns, and hearing damage. Even then, witnesses later said he kept asking if the radio was still working. He did not ask if the line had held. He asked if the signal was still alive. That detail stayed with many of the men who saw him that day. News of what happened travelled slowly. In the chaos of the Italian campaign, there was little time for celebration. The fighting around Anzio continued for months. German forces launched more counterattacks in February, using infantry, armour, and artillery in repeated efforts to crush the beachhead. Each time, Allied defences held, relying heavily on coordinated fire and rapid communication. Behind the scenes, commanders took notes. Anzio reinforced a lesson that modern war was no longer just about numbers or bravery. It was about information. Radios, often overlooked, became as critical as tanks. A broken radio could doom a unit. A working one could save an entire front. When Vossler eventually recovered, enough to learn what had happened, he did not speak like a hero. He said he had only done his job. But the army disagreed. His actions were reviewed, verified, and documented. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor, not for killing the enemy, but for staying connected when everything else was falling apart. It was a rare recognition of how vital communication had become in modern warfare. The German failure at Anzio did not come from a lack of courage or planning. It came from an inability to silence the flow of information. Their tanks were powerful, their crews were experienced, but armour without surprise and coordination becomes vulnerable. Every movement they made was observed, reported, and answered with steel from miles away. For the soldiers who survived that day, the lesson was unforgettable. Wars are often remembered for generals and famous battles, but they are decided by small moments and quiet decisions. A radio operator choosing not to leave his post, a damaged antenna being repaired under fire, a message repeated one more time to make sure it is heard. At Anzio, one voice carried through the noise of exploding shells and burning engines. That voice kept the guns firing accurately. It slowed an armoured division. It bought time, and in war, time is often the difference between survival and collapse. Today, when people talk about armoured warfare, they focus on tanks, firepower, and speed. But the story of Anzio reminds us of something deeper. Steel alone does not win battles. Information does. Coordination does. And sometimes the fate of thousands depends on one exhausted soldier, hunched over a radio, refusing to let the line go silent. This is why the story of a single radio operator halting an armoured assault still matters. Not because it sounds dramatic, but because it is real. It shows how modern warfare truly works. And it proves that even in the middle of chaos, one steady voice can change everything. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.